Welcome to the Classical Gabfest, a weekly discussion about the ever-changing world of classical music. I'm your host for this week, William White, and with me, as always, are Tiffany Liu and Kensho Watanabe. This week, we'll be discussing the performance of an organ work by John Cage that just changed chords for the first time in 7 years. Then we'll review a new documentary called The Bowmakers about the life and work of 5 craftsmen of violin bows who all live in the same small town in coastal Washington state. And finally, we'll discuss YouTuber Adam Neely's recent viral video, Music Theory and White Supremacy. But first, we like to start with our prelude segment. So, Tiffany, what do we have today?
This week we'll be playing a round of everyone's favorite game, Who Dis? Jean Sibelius famously said, "A statue has never been set up in honor of a critic." And indeed, some critics have gotten it famously wrong. So, in this game, I'm going to read a critical quote panning a now beloved piece of music, and it's going to be up to my co-hosts to guess what piece is being referenced. There are 3 hints after the critique itself that are available to our competitors today. The year of the critique, the country it was made in, and finally, a 3-second clip of the work in question. We're keeping score in this game. Name the piece right off the bat, and you'll get 4 points, but for each of the 3 successive hints, you'll be awarded 1 point less. So once our contestants decide they have their answer, they'll write it down and they're locked in. I should say all these quotes come from Nicholas Slanimsky's The Lexicon of Musical Invective, a notorious and very hilarious book beloved by classical musicians. Okay, you guys ready to play?
Yeah, I'm stoked.
Fantastic. Okay, so here is our first quote. By dint of looking through the small end of his lorgnette, this composer gives us the impression not of the ocean, but of the basin at the Tuileries Gardens. Ideas that float over these juxtaposed harmonies seem like a costume made for Harlequin, and the music that results from this is, so to speak, invertebrate. It is inlaid work, it is not a painting. The audience seemed rather disappointed. They expected something big, something colossal, but instead they were served some agitated water in a saucer. Kensho is looking at me quizzically.
There were some words in there that really threw me off the scent.
Oh, interesting. There are also some words in there that I think will point you in the right direction. So I would play word association with this one. I would go ahead and just do the first thing that comes to your mind. Will, are you in the know?
I'm locked in.
All right. I thought you might be.
Let's keep going for me. I'm not going to lock in yet.
As a first hint, I'll give you the year of the critique, which is 1905.
Okay. All right. I'm going to lock in.
All right, Will, go ahead. What's your guess?
Claude Debussy, La Mer.
Okay. And Kensho, what is your guess?
I also locked in, just one step a little bit later, Claude Debussy, La Mer.
Okay, so what tipped you off, guys?
Well, to me, it was pretty obvious when I heard mention of the ocean, and because, of course, La Mer means the sea in French. When I heard mention of the Tuileries in Paris, I knew it was probably talking about a French piece, so that confirmed that it would be Claude Debussy.
All right. After the first round, Debussy La Mer, we have Will with 4 points, having guessed the piece without any of the 3 hints, and Kensho with 3 points, having guessed after receiving the hint that it was written in 1905. Ready to go on to the next round?
Oh, yeah.
This piece sounds for the most part morbid, strained, and unnatural, much of it even ugly. Melody has become by this time a pretty vague term, but when it comes to an oboe and a clarinet making absolute speeches at each other, the listener's mind is at so great trouble to remember what the first has said that it is impossible to appreciate whether the reply of the second is pertinent or not.
Scanning my brain for all oboe clarinet solos.
That's exactly what you should be doing. Shall I give you the date? Will that help?
I don't think it will help, but sure.
Yeah, I need the date.
Yeah, here we go. The date of this was written 1878.
Ooh, okay. Earlier than I expected, actually. I think I need more information.
I'm going to lock in.
Whoa!
The piece was premiered in Germany, or I guess what we now know as Germany.
Okay. But then I need to think of the piece.
Okay, and I'm gonna, instead of playing the 3-second clip, which I think would take all the fun out of this, I'm just going to read you another snippet of another critique with the same work. So this other review of the same work, which was likewise negative, says that this piece seemed to us as hard and as uninspired as upon its former hearing. It is mathematical music evolved with difficulty from an unimaginative brain. How it ever came to be honored with the title of the 10th Symphony is a mystery to us.
Okay. I did write something down.
So, I mean, let's get to the answer of the puzzler, Will.
Well, in a bid for more points, I locked in early, and I have to admit that I locked in incorrectly.
Oh.
I said Johannes Brahms Symphony Number 3.
Oh.
But I now know from the further clues that that was incorrect.
And which one of those further clues tipped you? Was it the other review?
Yeah, it was the other review. When you said it did not deserve the title of the 10th, because I believe that what we were referring to is Johannes Brahms Symphony Number 1, which did get this moniker of Beethoven's 10th, since Beethoven only wrote 9 symphonies, and after he died, Brahms was considered the inheritor of his tradition, and so his first symphony, people called it Beethoven's 10th.
That's right. So that was Brahms's first symphony. Is that where you ended up, Kensho?
No, I was on the Mahler train after hearing like the 10th Symphony, and I was like just trying to do the dates on Mahler, and I was like, oh, it could work. And so I had Mahler 1, as with the oboes and clarinets squawking at each other. So that's where I went with that one.
All right. At the end of round 2, we have awarded no additional points, and so Will stays in the lead with 4 points, and Kensho with 3.
So I just got to go for broke here. And
You should just jump in. All right, here we go. If it were possible to imagine His Satanic Majesty writing an opera, this would be the sort of work he might be expected to turn out. After hearing it, we seem to have been assisting at some unholy rites, weirdly fascinating but painful. It is difficult to say what ideas governed this composer in setting the libretto, but it is certain that a great portion of the music resembles that of the Venusberg and Tannhäuser, as being at once forbidding and alluring, but here the similarity ends. Tannhäuser is intensely human, but the dramatis personae in this opera are no types of living beings. The characters evoke no interest in the spectators, nay, more, they are eminently repulsive. Indeed, so repulsive was the subject of the opera that some of the best artists of Paris declined to be included in the cast. In the introduction, we have a noisy, blatant theme which starts off wildly without preface. Scarcely have we recovered from our surprise when the bright key of A gives way to F, and a jovial march is heard. This gives place to a curiously chromatic, not to say ugly, phrase andante breaking off upon a discord. There are 2 puzzled faces looking at me.
Okay, yeah. I'm gonna lock in.
Kensho's going for
I'm
broke,
just gonna go for
in.
it. I just
Wow.
I gotta go for the win. I'm not gonna lose.
Would a date be of interest to you, Will?
Wait. I want to think a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's a lot of clues in there that point one towards a date and a place. But
You have doubts.
I have such doubts. Well, the way that the rules of this game are set up, it's stupid for me not to just lock in since Kensho's already locked in. Because if neither of us get it right, I still win.
Gaming the system, Will White.
Okay, I'm locked in.
Okay, Kensho, as the first person who locked in, what was your response?
I went with Strauss Salome.
Mm-hmm. And Will, what was your response?
My response was Carmen by Bizet.
All right, and I think instead of telling you, I think I'm just gonna play this opening for you.
Oh my God, I was right. I can't believe it. I really can't believe it.
Yep, that was indeed the opera Carmen by Georges Bizet. All right, so this game turned out to be quite difficult, but in the end, we have Will emerging victorious with his 7 points, and Kensho with his valiant goose egg.
And I will continue to not read reviews. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think that's the lesson here, right? Is that, like, people are wrong and we should look for meaning inside what we are doing rather than what other people say about what we're doing. Okay, that just about does it for this week's Prelude segment. Before we wrap up, we'd like to put a call out to our listeners. We are planning to do a listener-generated Name That Tune, so we invite you to try and stump us. Check our show notes where you'll find a link to the form, and you can upload a 30-second unidentified piece of classical music for us to try to identify. Okay, and with that, we're going to move on to our first topic proper for today. Kensho, what do you have for us?
Well, we all know the saying, it's 5 o'clock somewhere, right? Well, did you know that you can safely say there's a performance of a John Cage work occurring somewhere and be correct, at least for the next 620 years? On September 5th, 2001, in Halberstadt, Germany, a performance of John Cage's work for organ entitled Organ Squared /ASLSP, or As Slow as Possible, began. 19 years later, September 5th, 2020, marked the 14th chord change in the lethargic progression of the piece, as 2 new pipes were inserted into the body of the organ that has been custom built to, quote-unquote, play the new chord. Let's listen to a clip of this historic event.
Keine Trittleiter. Aber Kai, übergib ihm bitte die E-Pfeife, das eingestrichene E. Für diejenigen, die gute Ohren haben, können versuchen, die ganz kleine Pfeife in der Mitte auch noch zu hören. Das ist nämlich eine Oktave höher, das E.
The performance is slated to last a total of 639 years, calculated to match the age at the start of the performance in 2001 of the first modern keyboard organ, also located in Halberstadt. This piece is so slow that every change is a major event featuring the ritualistic changing of the organ pipes. Tiffany, how do you feel about a performance that will outlast many generations?
You know, when I first heard of this, the first thing I thought about was that corpse flower that people travel from miles and miles around to go see whenever it blooms once every 7 years. That was the first thing I thought of. And so, more like a museum installation than anything else, right? And, I think I would be down to go see, a tree that emitted spectacular blooms once every 300 years. I would probably be down for that. As a performance, jury is a little bit still out, but that was the first, kind of cultural reference point that I thought of.
I think that this may be the single most German thing ever to happen. John Cage is an American composer, but I think it's no mistake that this particular performance, this interpretation is happening in Germany. It's precisely engineered based on thousands of years of history, and they know to the second exactly when the pipes have to be changed, and there can be no interruption to that schedule. It has to proceed exactly as specified. The fact that it's like an avant-garde art installation taking place in a small city inside the dilapidated church. That's extremely German. And just the fact that it blends sound art with enduring a kind of torture, like a sort of self-flagellant penance. The only thing that could make this more German would be if the sandbags that are weighing down the organ pedals were filled with literal human feces. I think that would be the only more German thing that you could do. But so anyway, that's my take. Very German.
Wow.
Yeah, let's talk about just how this performance is being done right now. So we talked about the changing notes, being added pipes, and there's no human that's actually, forced to chain to the organ and holding down the pedals. It's, again, there are 3 pedals that are basically weighted down by these sandbags attached to them, as Will so eloquently put. So what I want to get to about this is kind of the idea of performance as spectacle. So something like this where everybody gathers to see this kind of performative event within a larger performance, as opposed to a spectacle within a performance. Something that I think of as something like opera, where there's something that's really interesting happening, or some of these kind of Cirque de Symphony concerts where you have aerialists, flying over the orchestra in a performance as kind of an added bonus to a performative event. So how do we feel about this particular performance if we can call it that. And we were just talking about critics. I mean, is someone going to review this performance across generations? I have so many questions about this. Is such a non-traditional way of performing music, as we know.
I can't say that it generates a lot of interest on the face of it for me. While I do think that the existence of the event is kind of a cool footnote that I want to meet the anthropologist who in 600 years is going to sit down and like try and find all the historical footnotes that have been made and like all the e-trash that's been generated talking about this and see what they end up digging up, because what do you say about it other than that it happened? That's what I kind of want to know, because in fact, like when you generate a spectacle as performance, what you'd like to generate is actual conversation about it. And so, I don't know, I mean, we can kind of go down the rabbit hole of what is music. I mean, that's a question that John Cage is perennially engaged in, right? I mean, examples that we know that made him famous are all the ones that address this very question. And so that's actually, I mean, that's an interesting question. And if we want that conversation to last 620 years, hey, I mean, go for it. But the parameters of the actual performance itself, I wouldn't say inherently carry a lot of interest for me.
Yeah, let me just pick up on that and let me talk a little bit about John Cage for some of our listeners who might not be so familiar with him. You know, John Cage was a 20th century composer. He wrote music in such a way that it's supposed to invite larger conceptual thinking about what is music. So Tiffany, you just said there's this famous piece, 4 minutes and 33 seconds, where there are performers on stage and they are given instructions to sit in the same place and not move, not make any sound for that duration of time. And the quote-unquote music that happens is whatever happens in the atmosphere, in the surrounding environment. So he's inviting you to ask, what is the nature of sound? What is the nature of music? Does sound have to be organized or structured in order to qualify as music? And a lot of his pieces work this way. You know, he has a lot of pieces where performers are spread out over a large spatial area, and the audience members will go in between from performer to performer. And so where you are located in the space really makes a big difference of your experience of the piece. So I think that this performance, quote unquote, does invite a lot of these questions. You know, there's no doubt about that, because you're thinking about what is the nature of time? What is the nature of generations? What is the nature of sort of a global frame of reference?
Yeah, and maybe this is where I think also we can take this conversation now in terms of, you know, we invite everyone to look at the show notes and watch this historic event, because I just wonder how many people gathered around that organ and held their phones out and saw the pipes go into the instrument and not actually be able to perceive anything had changed in that moment. Because as someone that was watched that YouTube link, I was kind of, you know, even myself, like knowing that something slightly changed in the chord, I was kind of like, is that it? Yeah, waiting. Did it happen yet? Which is kind of how it worked. And again, this speaks to what Will just said about, you know, the perception of time and having the questions, you know, being asked that way in terms of how do we mark time in this way, where 639 years later, someone's going to look back to 2001 when we first started this. And September 5th, it was before 9/11. That this performance, it was 6 days before 9/11 that this performance had started. And think about how far this world has changed, how much this world has changed since then. And we're only 14 chords into this piece.
Well, you know, and that I mean, it all depends on your definition of possible, because it's as slow as possible. So, I mean, like...
Right, and this is a question too, right? Is it just humanly possible? Because this is no longer a completely human endeavor, in that, you know, no human is actually holding down the pedals of the organ, though there are humans changing the pipes into changing the notes. So and this is a greater question that I want to ask both of you, is if there is kind of a non-human automaton aspect to a performance of art or a work of art, is it still art?
I think it is, because I think that the art is what went into the creation of like I was talking about, the engineering behind the project. The art is in choosing the space. It is in figuring out what the time frame is going to be and linking that to the history of the town and the history of musical instruments. The art is in custom building the organ that is performing it. And the art is in truly the intergenerational passage of this performance tradition that is going to be handed off as people die and as other people come up in this town and get interested in this project and get interested in the music of John Cage.
I'm going to come at it from the audience perspective and say that still also, yes. In coming at it from the perspective of the audience rather than the creator, I think it's also allows us to acknowledge that music is not just what was in the composer's brain when they created the thing, right? Music is, and the act of participating in musical performance involves a dynamic exchange between the consumer, the audience, and the creator, which in this case doesn't even have to involve the composer, you involve the people who are changing the organ pipes in 300 years, for example. And I don't know. I think that have you guys read 2001: Space Odyssey?
Seen the movie, but I've never read it.
Okay, so in it, he talks about these beings, extraterrestrials, that live on a different plane with regards to the fourth dimension, and so they've always existed because to them time is just flat. It doesn't take time the way that we perceive it. And so let's say that you are a matrix of light being. Beethoven's symphonies would be too fleeting for you to even notice that they were there. If you're a hummingbird, the speed of your heartbeat is too fast for a human to even appreciate hardly, right? It matters what your constitution as a living being is. And so let's say that there, and in all likelihood there probably is some being out there that lives within the fabric of space-time in a different way than we do. That actually this might sound like something. This might sound like 14 chords that are actually moving along at a speed that could be processable or interpretable as something other than what it seems to us, right? It does require you to sort of zoom out a bit, I think, which I think is actually probably part of his intention. Now, is it art that I'm going to appreciate? For me, I want art and music to be something that I would actually want to sit down and look at or listen to. Do I want to listen to this? No, I do not. I'm just going to say that right up.
I have a question for you guys. Would you rather spend an hour inside this church listening to the cipher play on this organ, or would you rather spend an hour listening to 1,000 elementary schoolers play recorders in an auditorium? Just a little callback to last week.
That's a good would you rather. I think I would take the 1,000 recorders, actually.
Oh, really? Interesting.
I think I might take the organ.
Yeah, I would take the organ.
I would just need some kind of stimulus other than just a drone that will,
Kensho needs stimulation. I guess it would depend on if you would give me one of the recorders or not. Because if I could steal one from some kid and be like, no, my turn, then okay, yeah, sure, I'll go with that one.
I do want to say one thing that I find maybe heartwarming, I don't know about this, is this kind of lineage of Halberstadt, John Cage organ as slow as possible curators that will be passed down from generation to generation. I'm imagining a small family that's going to be entrusted across generations to take care of this organ and make sure the sandbags are appropriately weighted, and I kind of like that idea, regardless of whether or not we could call this a performance. Somebody that's actually going to be not just one person, but an entire many generations of people, making sure that this performance continues to last for hundreds of years. Well, this discussion should have lasted another 638 years, but we are moving on. Will, what do you have for our second topic?
The Bowmakers is a 2019 documentary by Ward Serrill. In it, Serrill explores the lives of 5 of the world's top creators of violin, viola, and cello bows, who all happen to live in the same small town in coastal Washington state. In addition to chronicling their lives and work, the film also looks at the history of bowmaking as it extends back to 19th century France, and the way that the Brazilian Pernambuco trees used in the manufacture of bows are now part of a worldwide trade network. Let's listen to a clip of the trailer.
The violin gets all the press, although we all know that the bow is more important.
The bow is an instrument in itself. This is kind of like the silent servant that's super key to the whole element.
You look at the bow and say,
bow making, I mean, who knows anything about bow making?
The producers of the Bowmakers have partnered with a number of American classical music institutions to present this film online, including my own organization, Orchestra Seattle Chamber Singers. So do know that if you purchase a ticket in the next 4 days from the day that this podcast drops, you will be supporting my organization. That's this week's disclaimer. All right, with that out of the way, what did you guys think of this film?
Well, I really enjoyed this film. And as a string player, of course, knowing some of the details going into what it takes to make a bow and the craftsmanship and the appropriate amount of training that is involved in this, that part wasn't such a surprise to me, but it was certainly interesting to see and hear about the history of the Pernambuco trees, with the original usage of the wood being for the dye that would come out of the wood, rather than the qualities of the wood being a lot stronger than other wood, making it useful for this kind of craftsmanship. So I was really interested in that. And I thought it was a really well-made film as well. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, I mean, so another small disclaimer is the fact that we're all string musicians, and so we have a very particular window, viewing this. And I would say that for the lay listener, somebody who wasn't a string player, or maybe even a musician who wasn't a string player, right, that this would maybe have a different feeling than it does for the three of us. And we invite you to give us your thoughts if you end up viewing this film. But for me, I would say that the human interest angle of the documentary is really successful. I mean, I didn't know that the bow making industry was basically limited to a select number of 5 to 6 individuals who had basically all come from the same, we'll call it family, right? Training family, in the same way that we think of our teachers, conducting teachers or violin teachers as our musical fathers and grandmothers. So, very small heritage of artisan craftsmanship going on here. And that's very beautiful to see, right? I mean, I will say that I consume quite a lot of television made in this vein from the food angle, because I like watching food that I have no access to consume and drooling over it. But that's another sphere that I think shares the same feeling of families handing down very protected, well-made materials and knowledge to the next generation, knowing that if they don't do that, handing off, then there's a very high chance that the trade itself or the recipe itself or the approach itself will in fact disappear forever. And I think that is something that the documentary also slides itself into as a way of preserving at least the fact that this body of knowledge exists, right?
Yeah, so it was interesting to also see and hear that this kind of lineage, or the root of that tree or the top of that tree, almost died out as a result of the war, right? This kind of the Mirecourt school lineage that really did produce all of these master Bowmakers was made so to ensure that this kind of French school of bow making survived those things, and this is where the origin comes from. That was really interesting to me. And it's interesting, Tiffany, that you mentioned about the food aspect, or the relation to food. When you think about these kind of master chefs that also then have their apprentices that they go on to then start their own restaurants, in that way, those chefs also riff on their training to kind of create something new or find a new way of doing things. But one of the things that really struck to me was when Charles Espy, one of the Bowmakers, says that nothing has changed in this industry since 1850. That this is really an art that's trying to just, is preserving the tradition rather than kind of pushing the boundaries or doing something new. Even these people that, may have found new ways of doing things, it's all kind of within this box of not changing what's been done since 1850.
Yeah, there was that. But then as you mentioned, that there's a major connection with France in this movie, which is that the tort style of bow making is what is generally done. That's like the major school of bow making. It comes from France in the 19th century, and there's still major practitioners there. And the documentary actually goes to France and talks to a French bow maker, and eventually to his daughter, who is now a French bow maker. And the French guy, he says that he doesn't understand what contemporary bow makers are doing. He says, from the element of style, I can't wrap my mind around it. And of course, I look at it, I'm like, well, it just looks like a bow, So that kind of surprised me.
Yeah, you're getting at actually the one thing that I mean, not the one thing, but the general approach of this documentary, which left me wanting more, which is that like they would make tantalizing statements like that, and I'd be like, what don't you get? You're making the same thing as your daughter is making, as her granddaughter is going to make, and all this. What is it that you don't get? I want to know more. Like, what is so philosophically different that you can tell just by picking up the wood? And in the same vein, there were a number of opportunities, I would say, earlier on in the documentary especially, where they would make statements. I mean, they spent a long time kind of making statements like, oh, the feel of the wood is important, or something like this. And for me, that's all very artistic and good, but I want to know, what actually is that mechanism called? And also, what do you do to it to make it different ways? You see in the documentary several times, bow makers, they'll take a look at it, the bow from one end. They'll be shaving the stick of wood, and then they'll take a look at it as if they were looking down a gun scope. And what are they looking for in that moment? Now, I know that as a string player, you're looking for the fact that you don't want the bow to warp left or right. But I'm sure that there's probably 10 other things that they check for in that instant. Like, what are those things, And I think also, any sort of basic primer, there is 1 second where they say, okay, there's a mechanism that attaches here, and this is adjusted here, and this is hollowed out here. But, I want a diagram, and I want a couple labels just so that I can hang my hat on a couple terms that I learned. There was not quite enough technical interest for me in the story.
How much of that, in this terms of not having the technical stuff be revealed so much was intentional, you think, by the filmmaker? Because there was an instance in which I think one of the bow makers, equates it to kind of alchemy, and, you don't really know, what exactly changes, certain nuances of sound in the bow, but it just happens, or someone, the masters know how to do it. And it's kind of interesting how maybe there's kind of a similar way of describing what conductors do, or even, musicians in general. How does that all happen? How do you know to go faster here? Or how do you know you can communicate? There's this sense of sorcery, alchemy in especially classical music or classical music performance that I think may have been kind of transferred also to the making of the bows as well. And, I don't know if that's a criticism of mine, but yes, I agree with you, Tiffany, that I think it would have been interesting to hear about those, if you want the sound to be more bright, what does the bow maker have to do to make sure that happens, in terms of the kind of causality of things might be interesting to see more. And if I may also throw out another kind of small criticism that I had about the movie, especially with the documentary, because I do enjoy them a lot, is I like the fact that they try to find the various angles that are kind of loosely associated with the subject of bow making. So I did enjoy the ecological preservation side of things, of going into Brazil to talk about the Pernambuco wood and how a lot of it has been farmed out, and there's these kind of small farms that are trying to recuperate how much wood is happening. But earlier on in the movie, they also talked about these kind of various parts of the bow being from other places. And, up until a while ago, ivory was being used in bows. And that's a big ecological issue that is still being dealt with to this day. And so I think they could have taken that more. If you're going to touch on that subject, then I wish they would have gone more in terms of what the ecological or the world impact is in terms of this trade that is so specialized.
One thing I thought was interesting from a filmmaking point of view is that so much of the score was contemporary music. And there's a lot of performances by well-known string quartets. There's the Miro Quartet and the Dover Quartet and a quartet called Brooklyn Rider, who really play a lot of contemporary music. So what did you guys think of the music used in the film and how it was used?
I loved it. That was actually one of the comments that I had held in reserve, was actually I really quite enjoyed the fact that it wasn't like an endless stream of, the Beethoven quartet greatest hits. That I was they did include Beethoven, played very well, by the way, but it was one of the lesser quoted passages from a later string quartet. It's not Opus 18 number 1, for example. And I thoroughly enjoyed the fact that the things that I was hearing as a background in the score in the movie were not recognizable, but were also very interesting. I was like, I want to know what those pieces are.
And more importantly, I think all the music that was used in this film was played by the artists that were featured in the film as well. So it wasn't like there was another kind of, score or tracking that was happening. It was really just the performances from the musicians that we're talking about, their experiences with the bows that they were using as well. So that was also an added layer to it of depth that I enjoyed.
Yeah, congratulations to the filmmakers on doing that, because I think that is quite a bit of artistic integrity, because any number of other even documentaries about classical music, right, are going to here's a great recording that we'll use instead of what's actually being, what you see on the screen. So I would say that that's commendable on the part of the filmmakers. Also, I wanted to mention how happy I was to hear fiddle music towards the in the first 10 minutes even, and that a number of the experts that they spoke to, I thought one of the most insightful comments about the feel of the bow came from the fiddler at the beginning of the documentary. He was saying something about how you can feel the bow sliding into a sort of flow or locking into a groove. And it is niche, right? But it's a little bit less niche than it could have been.
Yeah, well, as a way of wrapping up, I will say that I think that we can safely say that this is 3 thumbs up from the hosts of the Classical Gab Fest.
Yeah, go see it.
I think it's niche, but I also think that, we come at it from a very specialized perspective. But for me, the thing that I love about this documentary is I am recommending it to all of my friends, whether or not they're a quote-unquote classical music person. I think that there's so many angles to this. There's the human interest angle, there's the kind of regional angle, there's the global angle, there's the woodworking, there's the craftsmanship, there's the passage of art through time, and then, yes, of course, there's classical music is a huge part of it. So I certainly recommend it to our listeners, and just a reminder, the link to view the film is available in the show notes for this episode, and if you are listening to this after this podcast is going live right when it's going live in September of 2020. There are additional viewing opportunities that will be available. And after December of 2020, you'll be able to actually buy the DVD or get a direct download. So we encourage you to do that. And when you do, please reach out to us at classicalgabfest@gmail.com or on our social media and let us know what you thought. All right, Tiffany, what do we have for our third topic today?
Okay, for our third topic, we're going to discuss a very interesting video that dropped last week on YouTube. It's by New York City-based composer, musician / video blogger Adam Neely. Adam's video has garnered over 500,000 views, which makes it a pretty viral sensation when you consider it's not a 2-minute earworm or some new dance move, but it's actually just a 45-minute analysis of classical musicological culture. So the name of the video, Music Theory and White Supremacy. Let's hear a clip.
So if you're online and you see the phrase music theory, try replacing it with the phrase the harmonic style of 18th century European musicians and see if it still makes sense in context. Here is an article that claims to explain the genius of Lady Gaga using the harmonic style of 18th century European musicians. The article then goes on to highlight her song Bad Romance's use of the raised leading tone in a minor key, which was very popular in 18th century Europe. Very cool. This is a class that you can take all about the harmonic style of 18th century European musicians, and the way that you can tell is by looking at the...
From that opening statement, Neely goes on to explore quite a wide variety of topics. He talks about how Indian and other non-Western music theories can inform the study of European music theory. He talks about how non-white jazz and classical musicians have formulated their own versions of Western music theory, and how much of higher ed music theory in the States is based around the ideology of Heinrich Schenker, an early 20th century Austrian music theorist who connected his project as a music theorist to his blatantly racist worldview. The point is that music and music theory have cultural perspectives, and they're not absolute truths, they're not mathematical, and they're not just divinely objective truths. And a filter not only can, but has been applied to demonstrate a hierarchy of, as Adam calls it, white supremacy. All right, let's get a couple initial responses to the video. Will, why don't you tell us what you think?
There's actually a couple questions I have about the premise. I mean, I would say that the video, in its most actionable sense, is maybe meant for academics who are teaching music theory in higher education contexts. And so, Tiffany, of the three of us, you are the one with the most academic credentials. And in fact, you are teaching in academia currently. That's one of your professional endeavors. I was curious to know if you agreed with the kind of basic premise, which is that academia does set up Western European classical music theory as the universal music theory. Because I talked to some people and they said, when I took music theory, that wasn't explicit. More often it was explicit that this is this one refined area of expertise, and there's a lot of other stuff out there, and this is just one way of looking at things. What do you think about that? I was curious to know.
Well, it might be topical at this moment to recognize that actually the original title of the video was "Music Theory is Racist," and has since been changed to music theory and white supremacy. And when I hear people say, well, academics taught us that this was the only way to view the world, I sort of hear an echo of like, why didn't they teach us how to do our taxes in high school? It feels a little bit like that. And I don't want anyone to teach me to do my taxes in high school. Like, the idea is that you're teaching me how to think. And so if by doing that you're telling me how to draw a Schenkerian graph, I have no problem with that. No one ever told me that this is the analysis that I should take to all of my symphonic practice from here on out. That was, in fact, quite explicitly acknowledged not to be the case. Part of it is that this stuff is really difficult, and if you're making every freshman, every sophomore who's a music major in higher ed learn how to even do figured bass realization, for example, or writing full counterpoint, like, that's something that they're fairly likely to go into their professional lives and be like, this is not useful, But for me, that's not quite an argument as this is racist. Like that, I don't quite make that leap, despite the number of really excellent points that Adam makes in his video.
Maybe I kind of interpreted it a different way, or I'm coming in from a different angle. But isn't the video in a way talking about just acknowledging that the music upon which this analysis had been founded was coming from a place in which systems were just inherently racist at that time, and that Schenker's system is being propagated through the basics that people do learn in terms of like the figured bass, and the entry points into that is all kind of constructed in which to build up to Schenkerian analysis eventually. So basically there's always this kind of construct of, only studying pieces by, 18th, 19th century European male composers, just because that's all there was, or all that people were aware of at that time.
Yeah, you're definitely right. The idea is that the system, in terms of the information that we present as objectively true or a full landscape, and we call by as broad an umbrella term as music theory, is in fact very, very specific and only applicable to a fairly narrow slice of music compared to the music that has been produced by all of human history, right? Like, that is definitely, absolutely, and I don't think anyone is going to challenge that per se. And he really, I think I enjoy a lot of the examples that Adam draws on with, especially the Indian classical music. Like, I really enjoyed those. He references a particular YouTuber who explains the Indian scale and particular musical ornaments that are inherent to the style and that are have as much theoretical background and foundation as our own Western music theory does. And I think I'm probably actually going to get into some of that and learn something. And it would be good. What do you think? Would it be good to present music theory as sort of a world music theory and address, what we learn and have learned in music school as the harmonic style of 18th century musicians? Well,
yeah, I do think that. If I'm looking at this from the perspective of somebody who's, say, like the dean of a school of music, I think that there's a lot of actionable stuff in here, which is that when you enter a conservatory or a school of music or a university music department, even more importantly, I would say, the first course that they throw you into is this basics of analysis of 18th and 19th century European music. And, we've mentioned terms like figured bass, which is a sort of shorthand that musicians used in the mid 18th century to play keyboard and plucked string instruments in a chordal fashion without having to read a full score of music. And this is what we're expecting people to read. Or we are learning how to write four-part counterpart in the style of the Renaissance masters like Vittoria and Josquin. So to me, that is a very specialized track. And if I'm thinking of this from the perspective of like a dean of a school of music or the head of a music department, I would think that the most successful way to build my school of music would be to start with a broadly based foundation in the kind of terminology and concepts that unite a lot of different styles of music across the globe. Because then you can send students onto different paths. If it was a student like me, I would then take the European music path, because I think that I am one of the few people in the world who actually regularly uses all of the things that they learned in music school, down to the fact that, when I conduct Handel's Messiah, I'm sitting down at the harpsichord and I'm playing from a figured bass, part and having to do those realizations. But that's not for everybody. And I would think that, a school of music should teach jazz and rock and folk music, and perhaps if they have people with this specialty, they should try to recruit people to teach Indian, Carnatic, and Hindustani traditions or Turkish music theory. All of this kind of stuff. So, at a typical American conservatory, most people, I guess, if they're into the classical thing, they're going to go into this European music route, and then they can learn the figured bass and the Roman numeral stuff. But if you're trying to build up your school or your department, you want as many music majors as possible. So why not bring them into this one broad-based approach and then funnel them where they are going to go from there? So yeah, I did think so. And I guess one thing that I would mention now is, in a sort of strange confluence, there was a video posted by another big music YouTuber, a composer named David Bruce, who made this video, and it dropped the day after, kind of shockingly, coincidentally. And his video is called the Map of Music. And he does exactly this. It's like the outline of what a syllabus would be for a kind of very broadly based world music approach to music theory that you would do as an introductory course. We'll put that in the show notes. I would recommend our listeners watch that after watching Adam Neely's video as sort of a response to kind of get your juices flowing. I actually have a question for Kensho. There's this whole dust up in academic musicology about Heinrich Schenker and about, Schenker's so racist, Schenker's canceled, et cetera, et cetera. And that is a big chapter of this video. But we had talked about doing that as a topic on this episode. And one thing that we talked about was that neither you or I had studied Schenkerian analysis. And so we were not concerned about talking about the racial elements of this and the racist elements, but we were like, are we going to be out of our depths if we have to talk about Schenkerian analysis? So, one thing that I wonder, Kensho, what do you think about this? Did the music theory training that you got in conservatory, and you went to some of the best, you went to Yale and Curtis, how does that inform your practice as a working musician? Because obviously you're getting along just fine without having studied Schenker.
Yeah, I don't know how important it is, but it's important to also remember that all of this music theory stuff that we learn in schools is a system in which we can use, or a system that we can use to talk about music or to better understand it or have a discussion on the music that we're performing or listening or hearing. And this is how I also use my training as a performer of music now, is to just understand how the music is put together or how the music is written, so that I can make sense of something and then apply it to my own artistic ideas about how this performance should go. So inherently there's not this one answer or one truth to all of this.
Yeah, and the ideal, situation is to get to a point where you would realize, okay, this is where my training stops, and it doesn't explain this cool other thing, and that there are more layers. And that is something, yes, that does not get acknowledged a lot in education, period, right? Because in education, your teachers are supposed to have the answers. And so then if they haven't presented the answers to you, then it must be because I don't know,
My understanding of music theory is that it has a few points. It should either help composers write better music, it should help performers form more complete or interesting interpretations of music, or it should functionally link the topic of music to other disciplines in an interesting way. To me, that's the point of music theory.
Well, can you clarify better music? How does music theory help composers write better music?
Well, I mean, it can help in a number of different ways. Like, if you learn about the theory of acoustics, for example. So now I'm not talking about Roman numeral stuff, right?
Yeah, I just wanted you to clarify that, because that's also a problem, right?
That is a big problem. Yeah, right. So that and in a sense, that is the core of the problem, as Adam Neely identifies it, is that when we're talking about this stuff, we're just talking about Roman numeral and figured bass and the harmonic resolutions of Beethoven and Mozart. But of course, music theory is even in the Western context, is a much broader based idea.
Right. The fundamental idea of music theory is that there is an underlying logical system underpinning a work of music. That doesn't seem far-fetched or racist to me. It seems like it could become that if you decided that better meant, functioning according to like the fact that at some hand-wavy point in the middle of the piece that you should go to such and such a chord, right? But I think that the study of music theory, as you were saying, should help composers write better music, because it should help them discover that a system through which to compose. Like the fact that there is organized thought makes it more than a smattering of notes and like flinging ink blots at the staves. Okay, so to wrap up our topic here, go watch the video. It's quite thought-provoking, whichever way you swing, and I think that it's grounds for a lot of good conversation and, as Will says, actionable measures that can be taken in the course of musical education, especially in the States. So with that, I think I'd like to toss over to Kensho, who's going to bring us into our final segment of today's podcast.
Alrighty, so we are at the classical mixtape segment of our show. In our classical mixtape, we each recommend some music that's caught our ear this week to share with our listeners. So, Will, what do you have this week?
Well, because of our first topic, I was thinking a lot about organ music this week. And so I wanted to share, this is like basic bitch organ music, but I love it. Oh my God, I love it so much. This is Charles-Marie Widor's Organ Symphony No. 5. You know what I'm going to say, the Toccata. And I should say that the performance that I have chosen is by Frederick Hohman, and he is playing on the Schantz organ at the Cathedral Basilica of Newark, New Jersey. How do I love this piece? Let me count the ways. I mean, it's just, it's something that gets played all the time. Organists love it. I think sometimes in spite of themselves. There's like a trillion different renditions and interpretations of this piece. It's just it's so sparkly, it's just so it's so constant. It just keeps the energy flowing from beginning to end, and it's very repetitive, and yet it goes through like every key, and it has some moments of drama, and it's so much fun. I don't know, I love this piece. What did you guys think? Did you know this piece? I mean, to me it's like a famous piece, but did you guys?
I knew the piece. I have to say I am not a person that goes immediately to listen for organ music.
That's part of why I chose this too. I thought that you were going to neg on organ music. I thought that would be a very...
It's not that. I mean, I definitely...
It's not music for jocks. It's not for jocks. So, I get it. I get it, Kensho.
I was about to say nice things about this, but now I feel like I need to fulfill my role in just lambasting it. No, I actually enjoy this piece quite a lot, actually. And so I'm sorry to disappoint you, Will, but I am not going to neg on organ music. Alrighty, well, enough of that organ music, and let's go on to Tiffany's selection for the week.
All right, so today I have for you a piece about which I actually know very little, but enjoyed so much upon hearing it that I knew it had to be my recommendation for the week. So this is a Renaissance motet by Orlando di Lassus called In Monte Oliveti. And the performance that I've chosen is by the Hilliard Ensemble. Let's just listen to a little bit of it. I have to say, this week I was covering Renaissance and medieval music with my music appreciation class, and I was just randomly stumbling around YouTube looking for examples, beautiful examples, to play in class before the entrance of, as the students were entering the room. And I heard this, and I absolutely had to let it play the entire way through. I don't generally do that with this class. I give them snippets. I ask them to identify the number of voices. I talk about the feeling that they have listening to it. I had no words for when this came on. I just put it on, and I was just I had to let it finish. And then, of course, I sent it to them afterwards. I got no responses, but I just wanted to share this with the wider world because it's just such a spectacularly, I think the recording is exceptional. I think the singing is really absolutely angelic, and if I never have to hear other Renaissance music again, then that would be fine, but I want this recording.
I have a very interesting experience with Renaissance motets in general, actually. I still work at the Greenwood Music Camp up in Covington, Massachusetts, and for the staff and faculty that are there, a common pre-dinner activity would be to gather and sing motets before dinner just for fun and kind of sight sing them. So when I hear this kind of music, it brings me back to those pre-dinner hours and singing along with some friends. Obviously not as well as this recording, but it's definitely a fun activity, and I do really enjoy this music singing it. So it's really great. It's certainly a bomb after the organ Widor. Thank you very much, Tiffany. I have brought a piece that kind of touches upon many of the themes that we have discussed this week, with interminable performances, church music or music associated with the church, organ music, all of this kind of all wrapped up into one with Bruckner's, Anton Bruckner's Mass No. 3 in F minor. And the movement that I would like all of you to listen to is the sixth movement, or the Benedictus. Bruckner is known for his long symphonies and how his orchestrations are also related to the organ in terms of how the voicings and the instruments are used are very much kind of trying to replicate the sound of an organ. And I find this beginning of the Benedictus very much to be some of the more beautiful music that he wrote. Toward the end of this track, you get back to the kind of style of writing that you would expect from his symphonies, but this kind of lyrical, gorgeous vocal music that you don't necessarily associate with Bruckner, I find this Benedictus to be a really great example of that.
Can we talk about Bruckner for a second here?
Will's got an axe to grind.
Well, I definitely have a take. I think there's amazing music in all of Bruckner's pieces. Don't get me wrong. He knew how to write a flow of music. It's great. What I find lacking in Bruckner's music is wit. We talked a couple episodes ago about Haydn and Mozart, and they had a little bit of jokiness and playfulness and wit. And that is totally absent from Bruckner's musical vocabulary. And to me, that's
cardinal sin.
It's a deal breaker. It's a deal breaker for me. Just give me a little something, give me a little taste of why life is worth living. Everything with Bruckner is so, just endless. And, it's like this, it can be happy, but it's ecstatic, or it's transcendent. And it's just Anton, can we just chill a little bit? And then there's the whole Bruckner bro thing. I think that there's a toxic masculinity culture surrounding Bruckner, that all these brass players just love to lay into their chords and just oh, it's epic, man. That's always what you hear about Bruckner. So epic, So I don't know. There's some stuff, it's fine, but for me, I don't know. I would take Poulenc over Bruckner any day.
I don't know. If that's how you feel, bro.
Let's just say it's no surprise that you would bring Bruckner to the podcast, Kensho.
I feel like I brought something that is very much almost against the grain of that kind of Bruckner bro infatuation with the composer, no?
I don't know. Maybe so.
Tiffany, bring some sanity to this conversation, please.
You know, I will say that I've never, been to a live performance of a full Bruckner symphony, and that experience does not sound appealing to me. However, I live in a region of the country now that has gorgeous vistas and a lot
you'll
of
find the links
places
to all
to walk
these as well as
around
to our
in them.
classical mixtape YouTube
And
playlist in the
let's
show
just say
notes.
that certain
And that
composers
wraps up
make
our
more sense
classical
when you're out
mixtape
hiking.
segment.
And I think that's
And with that, it's time to wrap up this episode of the Classical Gabfest. I am William White, and on behalf of Tiffany Liu and Kensho Watanabe, I'd like to thank you all so much for listening and to encourage you to subscribe and rate us on Apple Podcasts. We'd also love your help spreading the word about the show on social media, where you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can reach us at classicalgabfest@gmail.com, and we would love to hear from you. Until next time, happy listening, and we will be with you again next week.